Prince Charles was in Jordan yesterday, he's in Kuwait today, and will be in Saudi Arabia tomorrow. What's with his continuing support for governments that attack journalists and torture prisoners? For these stories and more, let's go underground. RT journalists came under fire from NATO-backed forces in Ukraine in the past few days. The violence occurred as David Cameron was accused of being a foreign policy irrelevant by Britain's former top commander in NATO. Cameron was nowhere to be seen as German and French leaders flew to Moscow for peace talks with Vladimir Putin about the escalating conflict. But just because Britain is no longer involved in global decision-making doesn't mean that British media has stopped a propaganda onslaught that to some bears all the hallmarks of Cold War lies. According to Oliver Tickell, editor of the Ecologist magazine, organizations like the BBC are painting a distorted picture of what is happening in Ukraine, which could lead to all-out war. Oliver, welcome to Going Underground. Why did you feel the need to write this piece citing the BBC's use of Russian aggression?
Well, I was just at my computer typing away, as I spend much of the day doing, and the radio was on. It was Radio 4 World at One programme, and this meme of Russian aggression just started to come over very strong, and I listened a bit harder, and it was all about a speech that Jens Stoltenberg from NATO had made, and then there was a panel of people from places like the Brookings Institute and so on, and it just seemed that every single voice was just repeating this meme of Russian aggression. There was no one to put any other point of view, and I just got rather cross with it and thought, sod it, and I knocked out this article because actually there is scope for a huge diversity of opinion on this. There is no single narrative. There's a multiplicity of narratives that can be told, and I just wanted in this article to get across some of that spread of narratives, you know, that can be told and should be told about Ukraine, instead of this single narrative which is relentlessly being drilled into our heads by the BBC and indeed by other mainstream media.
We've tried to cover it on this program. In fairness, the people that would cite it as Russian aggression tend not to come on the show, which makes it more difficult to cover as well. But there's no doubt that the rhetoric, and you mentioned in your article, about Russian bombers invading, as we know they weren't invading, but it would seem to a member of the public watching, Russian bombers are in the English Channel right now threatening Britain.
Well, that did seem like a particularly ludicrous story.
Not to the journalists covering it, presumably.
I mean, there they were in international airspace, and it's interesting that the BBC was reporting that it was threatening Britain, when in fact, of course, the so-called English Channel is a bit of water that runs between Britain and France. And it might have been interesting to have heard what the French think about it, if the French felt under threat, but that side of it was completely excluded. So I just thought it was actually very weak and unconvincing reporting. And of course the other thing it didn't mention there is, well, what's NATO getting up to on Russia's boundaries? And I'm pretty sure that it's going to be a bit of a two-way street. You know, yes, you know, there are Russian aircraft sort of probing around our borders, but I'm sure that we are doing the same, and we've got satellites over Russia and Ukraine, and it's
in fairness, though, in fairness to the BBC, it is a time of austerity. They're facing perhaps cuts in their budgets. Wouldn't it be expected that a state-mandated broadcaster would toe the line of the government? Well,
you might think so, but in fact the BBC's editorial guidelines are completely clear that they have to report on all issues impartially. Now, one might say, okay, you know, that's what it says on this bit of paper, you know, but there's a realpolitik, they're worried about the licence fee and so on. But I think, you know, that the BBC does stand on its international reputation as an impartial broadcaster of record and with historically a lot of respect. And I think it should try and adhere to those principles. Nation shall speak truth unto nation.
You do make the point in the article that how serious this issue is, and you even talk, as some others have, of the serious risk being posed over Ukraine of a full-scale war between Russia and NATO. But you don't think it would seem absurd to anyone making editorial policy at the BBC when you say in your article that NATO possibly pose a greater danger to British national security because of their actions than Russian aggression?
Well, there is no particular reason to think that simply because we happen to be British that we are necessarily on the right side. Patriotism is all very well, and actually I think I am patriotic, but I think part of that patriotism is actually being prepared to criticise where I think that we are drifting from, you know, fundamental principles of human decency and human rights and all of these things that we are meant to be in favour of. But to come back to that point that you made before, you know, we have, well, I and indeed a whole generation have been through the process of mainstream media, and often with the BBC right in the forefront of it, beating these drums of war over Iraq, over Libya, over Afghanistan, over Syria. We've heard it before. And I think that our hackles instinctively start to rise when we feel it happening again. And there are particular reasons to be very worried about Russia. Because in the case of Iraq, they were essentially harmless. They couldn't touch us. None of those countries could really touch us, except perhaps through the medium of terrorism, which is, you know, certainly something to be taken seriously, but it's well short of full-scale war. Now, in the case of Russia, Russia has to be taken seriously. I don't think Russia wants to be taken seriously in this way. All of the indications are right up through the Sochi Olympics that Russia wished to be accepted as a modern, forward-looking country, taking its place on the world stage. And then suddenly this whole Ukraine thing blew up. I think that Russia was drawn into this conflict very reluctantly. It didn't want it at all. But ultimately, if it keeps on coming under attack, both military and economic and diplomatic, and if the military attacks in particular escalate, and we now see that President Obama is looking to supply Ukraine with lethal military assistance, it does seem to be escalating in a way that could ultimately prove very dangerous indeed. Because
in fairness, the mainstream even reported that the Americans were going to publicly, at least they're deliberating, supplying lethal arms to the Kiev government.
Yes, yes, they did. But, of course, the way that this is always presented is that they are very reluctant to do this, but they are drawn into it by Russian aggression and this unfortunate necessity to get involved.
To protect the civilians is the narrative we get here.
This is
it's America and NATO protecting the civilians.
And of course, this is where the media is so important, that you can have a politician making a stand of reluctance to get involved, while the media are going hell for leather, saying, we must act, we must do something, why are you standing back? People are dying, this is important, our security is at risk. And then, reluctantly, in a statesman-like fashion, the march to war progresses. And this is part of why, in fact, the media, the mainstream media, really have to be seen as part of this international security machine that is driving war and enabling war to happen, because actually ordinary people are very reluctant to get involved with war. I mean, war is the most terrible thing, as you know, any number of thousands of people in eastern Ukraine know right now. War is a terrible thing. We don't want war. So we really do need to have our appetite for war orchestrated in a really big way, and that is, it seems to me, what mainstream media are beginning to do with Russia, is to soften us up for a war, which could prove absolutely catastrophic.
So is it just a mystery as to why mainstream journalists, people at the BBC, don't understand that civilians are dying, and this is not just because of Russia somehow, and that it was that NATO are involved, and indeed Ukraine isn't even a member of NATO in the first place?
Well, I think that probably a growing number of people know due to the breakdown of monolithic media and the fact that a much wider range of opinion is now available through RT, through various blogs, through alternative media generally, I think that there is a much greater diversity of views out there. And I think, in fact, that the mainstream media are struggling now to engender the kind of enthusiasm for war that would have been a matter of course.
Because you mentioned Syria, obviously Libya, David Cameron did go into, but when the BBC showed the atrocities committed by President Assad, in a one-sided manner, arguably, that wasn't enough to persuade the British people to want to bomb Damascus this time. It didn't work.
There was no conclusive evidence that Assad actually had anything to do with those chemical weapons attacks. You know, and this is where the power of assertion by a state and by media.
But the media didn't work. The mainstream media didn't work.
Indeed, they failed, and I think the good sense of ordinary people and people who had been through this before with Iraq and Libya actually prevailed. And I think that Ed Miliband was probably quite finely balanced in his own judgment as to whether or not to support it, and he had a whole lot of Labour MPs coming to him saying, we came under strong pressure, we are under strong pressure from our constituents, they don't want it. Ed Miliband's opinion was swayed. They voted against it, and then that had a knock-on effect on America because it took the wind out of President Obama's sail to proceed to bombing in Syria. So it's an example of how sometimes these things are quite finely
But there seems
balanced.
to be a much more united front against Moscow, arguably, in which case, is there a danger we just sort of drift into war with Russia?
Well,
as the propaganda keeps coming here.
There is a danger, and that's why it's important to keep on challenging this propaganda and to point out that this narrative that we are being told is in one view a lie, and in any case, whether it's a lie or not, that there are competing narratives that we should be
But the Ecologist,
to.
in fairness, isn't quite as big as the BBC yet to challenge that narrative.
Absolutely not. But I think that probably the number of people who are politically active and contact their MPs about issues is relatively small. And so, although we don't have a mass reach, I would think, you know, that there is still at least some kind of small influence that we do have, which makes it worth doing, rather than simply packing up and accepting mainstream media narratives on these and other issues.
Oliver Tickell, thank you.